Tim Lawley last night, who was with Dave Joyce's office. And 9 of the top 100 precincts in that congressional district that are of concern relative to the next election are here in Solon. So we will be talking about that as we go forward, but that's a very important thing to know and something for us to work on. Now, to our speaker tonight, everybody I think is aware that 150 years ago today, Abraham Lincoln climbed a small wooden platform in a small farming community in a little town, southern part of Pennsylvania, and gave a speech to honor the 51,000 dead, wounded, and missing soldiers that had fought in a battle there the summer before. Now, a lot of people don't remember that Edward Everett, a former Secretary of State, spoke before Lincoln, and he spoke for over 2 hours. And Lincoln spoke for a total of 272 words, which is a pretty amazing thing. Nobody remembers Edward Everett's speech, but they do remember Lincoln's speech. Now, I don't want you to think that I'm going to play Edward Everett to Professor Forte's Abraham Lincoln. But if I were to take time to talk about all of the things and achievements and accomplishments and awards that Professor Forte has received throughout his long and illustrious career,
you make my mother really happy.
It would take an awful long time. And so I'm just going to summarize and say that Professor Forte is a constitutional law professor with Cleveland State University's Marshall College of Law. He has served as the chief counsel for the United States delegation to the United Nations. He has served as an alternate delegate to the Security Council of the United Nations for the United States of America. He has argued before the United States Supreme Court on a number of occasions and has advised and helped other organizations that have argued before the Supreme Court. He is called upon by the United States State Department frequently to consult with them on matters of international affairs and human rights. And so it really is appropriate, I think, on this anniversary of the Gettysburg Address that we have Professor Forte speak to us, because many of us here today feel that our freedom is under attack. And we have to remember that the last words of Lincoln's address were about, the nation being a new birth of freedom, and that it should not perish from the earth. Now, he didn't talk about freedom being lost in the United States or in southern Pennsylvania. He spoke about freedom being lost from the earth because he recognized how precious freedom was and how fragile it was, and what a unique experiment the United States was in the world history. There had never before been a country founded on the concept of individual liberty and freedom and limited government. So he recognized how precious that was. And so we are indeed fortunate and honored to have somebody like Professor Forte here to speak to us about constitutional issues, because he is today one of the warriors in the front line fighting for our freedom here in this precious country. Professor Forte.
In case he's going to talk.
Yeah. In case he
Did we not
comes
get a
Edward
microphone
Everett.
and we didn't notice we had no microphone?
That's all right.
Bob, what you said was so true. And when he finished that address, it said that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. He meant it literally. Because we were the last man standing. We were the last democratic nation standing. In 1848, every country of Europe had a number of democratic revolts. Everyone, except England, and England was inching towards more representative democracy. France, Spain, Italy, the various states of Germany, Poland, Russia, everyone failed. Not a single one succeeded. We were the last man standing. And we were the last man standing to decide whether a nation so conceived in liberty but not fully born yet. And that's what the Civil War was. It was our birth pains. Our birth pains becoming a nation truly free to correct the one flaw that the founders thought they had to make. You know, the thing that our founders, it had never happened before in history, that a people could rule themselves. People couldn't rule themselves. They're full of passions. Nobody thought a people could rule themselves. That's why you need aristocracies or kings. Imagine people, and the founders understood our passions. They understood we were flawed people, unlike the French who thought they were perfect.
And still do.
Remember Mark Twain's statement? How good and gracious is our Lord, who created man halfway between the angels and the French. We knew we were flawed, and we were the only nation in the Declaration of Independence claiming that all men were created equal and endowed with certain inalienable rights that they could never give up. We're the only nation to have ever set up a standard that we knew we were failing at the time we set it up. We knew we had to reach it later on. Imagine that. A nation founded on principles that convicts itself of not being complete yet. That's what Lincoln understood. Now I want to talk to you about one of the major ways in which our freedom is maintained. The founders of our country did not think the Bill of Rights was that important. They thought what would create a free country was a country that was structured in a way where government could do its job but not be so powerful that it would trench upon our freedom. They spent their weeks in that hot summer of Philadelphia constructing a government, not just writing phrases saying you won't take away the freedom of speech or freedom of religion. That would come later as a concession, and a worthy concession, to those who were hesitant about the Constitution. No, they thought a separation of powers, a division between the federal government and the states. As Justice Kennedy said so eloquently in one case, we split the atom of sovereignty. Never been done before. We Americans are so practical, we're inconsistent. Sovereignty means above which there is no other power. Sovereignty is unitary. There is only one sovereign. Not in America. No, we split it. There's the federal sovereign, and then we have the state sovereign. And we had organizational quasi-sovereigns, like religion. It was regarded by James Madison as the first duty that we owe to our Creator, otherwise known as religion, which men have before they even enter into civil society. I'm paraphrasing his speech, and against which civil society has no authority. Religion was a kind of quasi-separate entity of independence. Now the states are what I want to talk about today as elements of this structural independence by which we maintain our sovereignty. Now the framers had a problem with the states. First of all, they were tyrannizing their own people by printing paper money, destroying credit, putting up tariffs against one another. The western counties of Virginia, otherwise known as Kentucky and Tennessee later on, were flirting with the Spanish across the Mississippi to declare their independence so they could have access to the Mississippi. George Washington thought the state militias during the Revolutionary War were miserable. He could, and even his own troops of the line, the states would send him enlistments, which every January would give up, and he'd have to reform the army every January. Valley Forge was not a sometime thing, it was an annual event. So they were not too happy with the states, but they knew the states were the core of what made up for the Union. And so the device that they thought of was, we will form a central government that's energetic in only 2 or 3 things: foreign affairs, maintaining a currency, and maintaining free trade. The rest we'll leave to the states. We'll give that power to the federal government in spades. They deserve it. But the states will leave everything else. And then at Philadelphia, they had to decide, well, what's the structural relation between the states? And at first, the Virginia plan, which was the first plan out, it made a big mistake. It said, the Congress shall have all powers in which the states are incompetent. What's that mean? And also, Congress would have the power to veto any state law. Anybody want a civil war? Imagine Congress having a power to veto things. But as they listened to one another, one of the things, if you ever read the debates, if they go on week by week, that's so wonderful about the framers, it's not that they made compromises, well, you know, log-rolling compromises, we'll give you this, but they listened to the principles of the other side. And they listened to William Patterson from New Jersey when he said, the small states cannot be overwhelmed by the big states. And that's why they formed the Senate, being representatives of the states. The Senate originally, under the Virginia plan, was to be elected by the House, not by the states. And then they did something else. Instead of having Congress veto state laws, they simply said Congress will be limited to a set of delegated powers, and in those powers they shall be supreme. The states will know that from the get-go. Everything else will be left to the states. Oh, and one other thing they thought of. Why don't we make the states part of the central government instead of simply a separate entity which will be at odds with it? How are they going to do that? Well, the Senate was one. The Senate represented the states in the central government. Okay, who's going to set the electoral regulations? Let the states set the electoral regulations. Well, who's going to be eligible to vote for members of Congress? Who's ever eligible to vote for the most numerous branch of the state legislature? Why should the Congress set who the qualifications are for the electors, the voters of that? So the states were integrated into the central government. It was working pretty fine. Alexander Hamilton, when he became Secretary of the Treasury, he said, I want to take over all the state debts as well as the federal debts that are still hanging on from the Revolution. We'll take them over, and we'll issue federal bonds instead. It'll be a windfall to the states. Well, how are you going to pay off these federal bonds? I'll have excise taxes, we'll have a central bank, we'll have a stable currency, and the states were relieved of this burden, and all of a sudden had all this federal money coming in through interests on the federal bonds. And states went into this marvelous prosperity because of Alexander Hamilton. But then slavery was there. Slavery, the flaw. And as the 18th century, 19th century began to move forward, slavery, because of the cotton gin, because of the economic need for mass labor, became so important. George Washington, one of the great things about George Washington is he listened. He made tons of mistakes, really twice. And when he had during the Revolutionary War a meeting of his generals, it was a true confederational, collaborative effort. And one day Benjamin Rush, one of his friends from Philadelphia, wrote to him and said, General, have you thought about slavery? And he began thinking about slavery. And he made a number of rules in Mount Vernon. He would not break up families. No, he would not sell any slaves. They had become a family. If he bought a slave, he would not buy a slave that had a spouse. He would buy two of them together. And he began writing, how can I rid myself? My whole Mount Vernon is what I love. Some of these slaves I hold in trust when I married Martha. I can't take away her endowment. So how can I, and he worried about that all his life. And finally, when he died, he was the only founder to free his slaves, who was a slave owner. And he did it in his will. In the first clause after you pay my debts and so forth of his will, he set the slaves free, except the household slaves which belonged to Martha. He set them free. And then he had, that's great, go read his will, it's fantastic. And then in his third clause of the will, he said, and my administrators shall pay attention to every word. He did not want anyone undermining his desire, finally, that these slaves should go free, but he was an exception. And as the slave power grew, the states became more and more jealous of state power as a protector of slavery. And so as the 19th century went, the states, instead of being repositories of residual sovereignty, actually became aggressive, trying to grab more sovereignty from the federal government. So at one point, South Carolina believed in a doctrine called nullification, namely if the state believed that a federal piece of legislation was unconstitutional, it could nullify it within its borders. Well, goodbye Union if that happens. Andrew Jackson, who in many ways was not a lovely man, saw through that. He refused to allow that to happen. He refused to allow that to happen. And all the great minds of the early 19th century, Henry Clay, who might have been a marvelous president, Daniel Webster, compromised on this slavery issue leading up until the 1850s, desperately trying to hold off the day of reckoning. And it was Dred Scott and the South who started the Civil War, not only because they bombed Pearl Harbor, that they bombed Fort Sumter, not only because they bombed forts, I get my wars all mixed up, because they bombed, they shelled Fort Sumter, but because they wanted the national government, they wanted to be able to take their slaves into the free states and keep them. In other words, they wanted to nationalize slavery. That was their program, and Lincoln saw that after Dred Scott. So states became an unlovely locus of sovereignty, frankly, in the early 19th century. And did they change after the Civil War? No. No, they didn't. In 1865, after the defeat of the South, when Andrew Johnson became president, who was probably one of the two most racist presidents we've ever had, the second being Woodrow Wilson, the South began passing pieces of legislation called the Black Codes. And you had all these freedmen who were now illiterate and free from the plantations, and throughout the South, the Black Code said, if a black man does not have a contract for labor by January, these occurred in May and June and July of 1865, by January of 1866, he will be held to be a vagrant and will be arrested. And then bound out to labor as a vagrant. To whom? His old plantation. And if he finds a contract, the contract has to be for at least a year. If he breaks a contract, it'll be a criminal offense. If anybody tries to get him to work elsewhere, like a Northerner coming down saying, you want to work for me? That person inducing the breaking of the contract will be held criminal. Blacks could not hold any kind of a trade. In effect, the South was attempting to turn blacks from slaves into serfs, tied to the old plantations with yearly contracts. And the states, they thought into it. And so the Republican Congress said, one, no more slavery, Amendment 13. Number two, these are American citizens with privileges and immunities. They have the right to own property. They have the right to travel. You can't take that away. And three, you can't take away the right to vote. Now, much of that was undone by what? By Jim Crow afterwards. So when we get to the 20th century, we find that this residue of slavery and racism fuels a lot of states' rights rhetoric. When in fact, having a residual sovereignty should be a locus of freedom, of more choice, of limited government, not a source of being able to tyrannize over part of your population. Finally, when that was broken in the 1960s, could we begin to see the states again in their original and appropriate role, namely as a locus that's an alternative to the federal government. And gosh, just when that happened, we get Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society. And all of a sudden, the federal government comes creaming into what the states normally did and what private private entities used to do.